I have always been a fan of solo winter travel. There is something about the silence of a snow-covered landscape that helps me recharge. Last year, I found a listing for a place called Blackwood Lodge. It was a massive, historic estate in the mountains of Vermont that had been converted into a bed and breakfast. However, because it was the middle of January and midweek, the owner told me I would likely be the only guest in the entire building. The owner, an older man named Arthur, met me at the front door. He gave me a heavy brass key and told me he lived in a small cottage about a mile down the road. He said he would be back in the morning to make breakfast, but for the night, the house was mine. He showed me the grand library, the commercial-sized kitchen, and my room on the third floor. Before he left, he pointed to a narrow, spiraling staircase at the end of the hallway. He said, "That leads to the attic and the old servant quarters. The floorboards are rotten up there, and it is not safe. Please stay on the first 3 floors." I agreed, watched him drive away into the falling snow, and locked the massive front door. The house was incredible. It felt like stepping back in time. I spent the first few hours reading in the library by a giant stone fireplace, but as the sun went down and the wind started to rattle the old window frames, the house began to feel less like a cozy retreat and more like a vast, empty cage. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to head up to my room. The hallway was long and lined with old oil paintings of people who looked deeply unhappy. My footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded like drum beats. I reached my room, locked the door, and climbed into bed. I was almost asleep when I heard the first sound. It was a thump, thump, thump. It was coming from directly above me. I checked the floor plan in my head. My room was on the 3rd floor, which was the highest guest floor. That meant the noise was coming from the attic. The place Arthur told me was unsafe. I told myself it was just a squirrel or maybe a heavy branch hitting the roof. I tried to close my eyes, but then the sound changed. It wasn't a thump anymore. It was a drag. It sounded like someone was pulling a heavy sack of grain across the floor. It would move for a few feet, stop, and then move again. I sat up, my heart hammering. I looked at the ceiling. The dragging sound moved from the center of the room toward the corner, right where the spiral staircase was located. I waited for the sound of someone coming down the stairs, but it never came. The house went back to that heavy, oppressive silence. I couldn't sleep. I put on my robe, grabbed my heavy metal flashlight, and decided I had to know what was up there. I knew Arthur told me to stay away, but I couldn't spend the night in a house where I felt like someone was lurking above my head. I walked down the long hallway to the spiral staircase. The air felt much colder here. I began to climb. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each sound feeling like a warning. When I reached the top, I found a small, plain wooden door. It wasn't locked. I pushed open and shined my light inside. The attic was massive. Dust motes danced in the beam of my light. There were old trunks, covered furniture, and stacks of yellowing newspapers. I walked toward the area directly above my bedroom. I didn't find a person. I didn't find a squirrel. What I found was a chair. A single wooden rocking chair sitting in the middle of the floor. But it wasn't just sitting there. There were deep, fresh grooves in the dust on the floorboards. The chair had been dragged back and forth, over and over again. I shined my light around the room, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. That's when I saw the drawings. On the back of the chimney stack, someone had used a piece of charcoal to draw dozens of eyes. They were all different sizes, but they were all pointed toward the floor, specifically toward the spot where my bed was located in the room below. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. As I turned to leave, my light hit a small table next to the rocking chair. On the table was a plate with a half-eaten sandwich and a glass of milk. The milk hadn't curdled yet. It was fresh. I realized with a jolt of horror that whoever had been up here had left the moment they heard me coming up the stairs. I ran back to the spiral staircase, but I stopped at the top. From the darkness below, I heard a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic creak. One of the stairs was being stepped on. Then another creak, creak, creak. Someone coming up the stairs. I looked around the attic frantically for a place to hide. I ducked behind a stack of old trunks and turned off my flashlight. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to make my breathing as quiet as possible. The door to the attic opened. I heard the wet, heavy sound of someone breathing. They didn't turn on a light. They didn't need one. I heard them walk across the floor, their footsteps, and confident. They walked right to the rocking chair. I heard the wood groan as they sat down. And then the rocking started. Creak thump, creak thump. The sound went on for what felt like hours. I sat in the dark, frozen, listening to the person rock back and forth directly above my bed. I realized then that Arthur hadn't been trying to keep me safe from rotten floorboards. He was trying to keep me from finding out that he wasn't the only person living on this property. Around 5 in the morning, the rocking finally stopped. I heard the person get up, walk to the door, and head back down the stairs. I waited until I heard the distant sound closing on a lower floor. I didn't grab my suitcase. I didn't even grab my coat. I ran out of that attic, down the stairs, and bolted for the front door. I fumbled with the heavy locks, my hands shaking so hard I dropped the key twice. I burst out into the freezing morning air and ran to my car. As I was backing out of the driveway, I looked up at the third-floor windows. The lights in the attic were on, and standing at the window, framed by the white snow, were 2 figures. One was Arthur. He was holding a tray with a fresh glass of milk. The other was a tall, thin man in a tattered suit. Arthur was smiling, and he gave me a slow, polite wave as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the state barracks. I told them everything. When they investigated, Arthur claimed he was just looking after his brother, who had mental health issues and lived in the attic. Because it was private property, and the brother wasn't technically being held against his will, there was nothing the police could do. But I know what I saw in that attic. I know about the drawings of the eyes. And I know that Arthur didn't want me to stay away for my safety. He wanted me to stay away so his brother could watch me in peace. I don't go to bed and breakfasts anymore. I stay in big corporate hotels with bright hallways and cameras in every corner. Because every time I hear a floorboard creak above my head, I'm afraid I'll look up and see a pair of eyes looking back through a hole in the ceiling. I've lived in this house for 5 years, and until last winter, I never had a reason to feel unsafe. It's a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where people leave their holiday lights up until February and know exactly when the mail carrier arrives. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my time in my home office. Because I'm often on tight deadlines, I tend to be a night owl. I like the silence of 2 in the morning. No emails, no phone calls, just me and my work. Last January, we had a massive ice storm. The city was basically shut down. My neighbor to the left, a nice older woman named Mrs. Gable, had gone to stay with her daughter in the city, so her house was dark. The house to my right was currently for sale and empty. I was, for all intents and purposes, completely alone on my stretch of the street. On the 3rd night of the freeze, I was sitting in my office when I heard a sound. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a rhythmic ticking against the side of the house. I figured it was just ice falling from the gutters or a tree branch catching the wind. I ignored it and kept working. Around 3 in the morning, I went to the kitchen to make some coffee. As I waited for the pot to brew, I looked out the small window above the sink. The backyard was a sheet of white, lit up by the security light on the garage. I noticed something odd. There was a trail of disturbed snow leading from the empty house next door, across my lawn, and right up to my side door. But it wasn't a trail of footprints. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy like a large sack through the snow. My heart did a quick double tap in my chest. I turned on the porch light and looked closer. The trail didn't just lead to the door. It circled the house. It went to every single ground floor window. I immediately checked the lock on the side door. It was secure. I checked the front door. Secure. I told myself it was probably just a stray animal, maybe a deer dragging its leg. I was being paranoid. I took my coffee back to my office and tried to focus. 10 minutes later, I heard it. A soft, wet slap against the office window. I froze. My office is on the ground floor. I slowly reached out and moved the edge of the curtain just an inch. There was nothing there. just the dark woods and the ice. But when I looked at the glass, I saw a streak of moisture. It looked like someone had pressed their palm against the cold glass and slid it downward. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. The dispatcher was calm. She told me that due to the ice storm, response times were slow, but they would send a patrol car as soon as one was available. She told me to stay in a locked room and keep the lights on. I moved to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with a heavy flashlight in my hand. I felt like a child, afraid of the dark. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I was staring at the bedroom door when I heard the most terrifying sound of my life. It was the sound of my own front door opening. The beep beep of the security system alerted me that the door had been opened with a code. My breath caught. Only 3 people had that code. Me, my parents who lived 3 states away, and the previous owner of the house who was currently in a nursing home. I heard footsteps. They weren't heavy. They sounded like someone was walking through my house in soaked socks. Squish, squish, squish. They moved through the living room. They stopped in the kitchen. I heard the sound of a drawer being opened. The silver drawer. Then, silence. I realized I hadn't heard the footsteps leave. They were still in the house. I looked at the bottom of my bedroom door. There was a small gap between the wood and the carpet. I watched as a shadow blocked the light from the hallway. Someone was standing right outside my door. They didn't knock. They didn't try the handle. They just stood there. I was about to scream, to tell them I had a weapon, when my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from an unknown number. The message said, "The ice is so cold. Can I come in and sit by the heater?" I felt a surge of pure, icy adrenaline. I didn't reply. A second later, another text. "I liked your coffee. It smelled like vanilla." They had been in my kitchen while I was in the bedroom. They had watched me make coffee. I realized then that the trail I saw in the snow wasn't someone dragging a sack. It was someone crawling. They had been crawling around my house on their hands and knees, peering into every window until they found the one where I was working. Suddenly, the person outside the door started to hum. It was a low, tuneless sound. Then, they began to scratch at the wood of the door with their fingernails. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I lost it. I yelled at the top of my lungs, "I have a gun! The police are on the way! Get out!" The scratching stopped instantly. I heard the wet footsteps move away fast. Squish, squish, squish. I heard the front door slam shut. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They found the front door wide open. When they searched the house, they found a kitchen knife sitting on the counter, right next to my coffee mug. But the most disturbing part was what they found in the empty house next door. The basement door of the empty house had been kicked in. Inside, they found a small nest made of old curtains and newspapers. There were dozens of photos of me taken from the woods, pinned to the wall with sewing needles. The person had been living in the empty house for at least a month, watching me every single night. They had figured out my security code by watching me through my office window with a pair of binoculars while I let guests in. They never caught the person. The police found a pair of wet, oversized wool socks discarded in the snow near the woods, but the tracks disappeared when they hit the main road. I sold that house 2 months later. I live in a high-rise apartment now, with a 24-hour doorman and 3 different locks on my door. People tell me I'm being too careful, but they didn't hear the wet footsteps, and they didn't see the knife sitting next to a half-finished cup of coffee. I've lived in a rural part of Washington state for most of my life. Around here, winter doesn't just mean snow, it means isolation. When a big storm hits, you might not see a snowplow for 3 days, and you certainly won't see any neighbors. Last February, I was house-sitting for my older brother while he and his wife were on a cruise. They have a massive modern house sitting on about 10 acres of thick pine forest. The house is beautiful, but it's a fortress. It has high-end security cameras, motion sensor lights, and a gated driveway that is nearly a quarter-mile long. One night, around 11 o'clock, a notification popped up on the tablet my brother left for me. The tablet is linked to the driveway gate camera. Usually, it's just a deer or a falling branch that triggers it. But when I tapped the screen to see the live feed, I saw a car. It was an old rusted white sedan. It was parked right outside the gate, its headlights turned off. The gate is solid metal, so the driver couldn't see the house, but they were just sitting there. I watched the screen for 5 minutes. The car didn't move. No one got out. I figured they were just lost and trying to find a signal on their phone. I put the tablet down and went to the kitchen to make some tea. But 10 minutes later, the tablet chimed again. I checked the feed. The car was gone, but the motion sensor on camera 4, the one halfway up the driveway, had been triggered. Because there were no headlights, I couldn't see anything at first. Then the infrared night vision kicked in. I figured they weren't driving. They were walking up the driveway, right in the middle of the road. They were wearing a heavy parka and carrying a large plastic gasoline can. I felt a surge of unease. If their car had run out of gas, why had they parked it so far back? And why hadn't they buzzed the intercom at the gate to ask for help? I watched them on the screen as they passed camera 3, then camera 2. They were getting closer to the house. I turned on the exterior floodlights, hoping the bright light would scare them off or let them know I was watching. The figure stopped. They were standing about 50 feet from the front door. Under the bright LED lights, I could see them clearly. It was a man, but he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the gasoline can in his hand. Then, he did something that made my blood run cold. He didn't walk to the porch. He walked to the side of the house, where the large propane tank for the heating system was located. I ran to the side window and looked out. I saw him unscrewing the cap on the propane line. He wasn't looking for gas. He was trying to tamper with the fuel for the house. I grabbed the intercom and shouted through the external speakers. "I've called the police. They are on their way. Leave right now." The man didn't jump. He didn't even look startled. He slowly turned his head toward the speaker. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was completely blank, no expression at all. He held up the gasoline can, and I realized it wasn't gas. Through the translucent plastic, I could see it was filled with something dark and thick. He poured the liquid all over the side of the house, right near the wooden deck. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a flare. I didn't think. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen, ran to the side door, and threw it open. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I didn't have a gun, but I acted like I did. I kept my hand in my jacket pocket and pointed it at him like a barrel. The man stared at me for 3 long seconds. The flare was in his hand, unlit. Then, he simply turned around and started walking back down the driveway. He didn't run. He just walked with that same steady, terrifying pace. I slammed the door and locked it, then watched him on the tablet. I watched him pass camera 2, then camera 3. When he reached the gate, he didn't go to the white car. He kept walking past it, disappearing into the dark woods on the other side of the road. The white car stayed there. When the police arrived 40 minutes later, they checked the white sedan. It had been reported stolen 2 days prior from a town 3 hours away. Inside the car, they found dozens of empty gasoline cans and a map of the county. On the map, several isolated houses had been circled in red. My brother's house was one of them. The liquid he poured on the house was a mix of used motor oil and accelerant. If he had lit that flare, the entire wooden side of the house would have been an inferno in seconds. The police searched the woods with dogs, but they never found the man. They think he had been living in the forest, moving from house to house, waiting for the owners to leave so he could watch them burn. I stayed at a hotel for the rest of the week. My brother installed 3 more cameras and a secondary gate, but I still don't like going there. Because every time I see a white car parked on the side of a road, I wonder if that man is still out there. I wonder if he's still carrying his plastic can, walking through the snow, looking for the next red circle on his map.